let's go ahead and continue our look at Asian art, focusing on Korean art, looking at how it represents wealth and ritual. So you can see Korea is a peninsula in Asia, and you can see that if we follow along the Silk Road, that many traditions that would have come from India and China eventually make their way to Korea, and then we'll also start looking at Japan. We're going to first look at a rather old tradition that is uniquely Korean. And so we're going to see a gold and jade crown. And this is from the Three Kingdoms period of the Silla kingdom from the 5th century. Now, when you look at this object, thinking about our theme, how does it express prestige and status? It has elaborate use of gold. So the entire crown is made out of rather thinly hammered gold. It has jade, which we know is very opulent in the East, hanging from it. And then overall, it has a lot of height and a great size to it. So this is a very elaborate headdress, right? So you could imagine if this was at candlelight or in sunlight, how this would possibly look. So it would really shimmer. All the light would reflect off of that hammered surface, and all those little jade medallions dangling and gold baubles and whatnot. So the content, what is the meaning behind this crown? Obviously, a crown has a function of being worn by someone important, but the imagery actually is very symbolic. So this is part of your content. There's a series of 5 vertical elements. So you see 3 in the middle, and then 2 on the sides, and they're basically shaped like trees and antlers. The Sillas used a lot of ornamentation, so lots of decoration dangling off of the part. This would cascade down your hair. The center image is thought to represent the world tree, and the world tree, like we saw at like a Hindu temple, has a vertical axis, so it's an equivalent to the axis mundi, so that connection once again of the heavens up in that sky space, and then connecting to the earth of the leader. The sides also have details that are reminiscent of reindeer antlers, and that would come from a very native species of reindeer from the Eurasian steppes that would have migrated to the peninsula. So when you look at the gold hammered space, you see that how it really reflects the light, but then you also in this detail really notice all these little pieces of jade. So what could be the possible meaning of all these little pieces of jade hanging off of something that represents the world tree? What do we typically find on trees? We find leaves or we find fruit. So these are supposed to represent ripened fruit hanging from the branches, would of course represent the Silla's fertility and abundance. So here's just a little bit of background. These crowns were excavated, and I can't pronounce it, so I apologize, but this was a former capital of Silla. So these crowns are made out of extremely thin. They would be really lightweight. So they weigh like 1 kilogram or 2 pounds. They're really, really light. So if the gold is super thin, what could they have been used for? It's pretty obvious it wouldn't be for everyday king use. So they were probably not worn like hats. They were probably used with formal attire or for special circumstances like different ceremonies. They were found in the burials of the emperor's tombs. So more than likely, they could have just been possibly used in the afterlife because they were so fragile. So some of these are also where there's different objects. This one's gold and jade, but there was others that were found with silver and bronze as well. So here's some different representations of other Sela crowns or headdresses that have been used. Some of them are a little bit more sturdy and don't have all that ornamentation. This is one that is, I think, in our textbooks as well as on Smart History. And here's an illustration of them. So you can see that some of them were probably a little bit more sturdy, like these two on the edges, but whereas the one in the center maybe was just for burial or special circumstances or ceremonies. So Koreans on this peninsula, on their peninsula, had very elaborate tomb practices. So how are Korean tombs similar to the Chinese burial practices that we already discussed? And what else was found with them? This is in the Smart History article. So we found a lot of gold objects there. We found weapons, and they were all laying around the body. And so they would have buried things of prestige with them. I wanted to show you a little bit of Korean pottery, even though we don't have it in our 250, but this is pretty common. This is called a celadon glaze. Celadon is kind of like this green sort of transparent imagery, and a lot of Korean pottery has almost like Chinese painting, like sumi calligraphy on it, with very delicate sort of images. This would be for plum wine. You can tell based on the shape of it. It's used for pouring wine. The next image that we have that's from Korea is this portrait of Sin Sukju, excuse me. And so from Smart History, we normally do a peer group work on this, but since we're just recording today, we're going to focus on the elements that we see here. So who was he? He was a really important politician. And he was not only a politician, but he was a scholar who eventually became the prime minister, and he served for two kings. You can see that he worked for two of them. So he was not, even though it says a prime minister, isn't necessarily what we think of as like somebody in charge, like in other countries. He was still just a typical politician. The kings were in more control. So the function of this painting was made to commemorate his achievements, and it would have been used in his life and in his death. And so it has telltale signs of details that tell us that he was a distinguished member of the court and he was loyal to the king. It would show that he was an honor to that crown. And so there's ways that this is portrayed. In the regalia that he's wearing and the clothing he has, and we'll talk more about those later. This would have been hung eventually in a shrine, and so families often would have rooms in their houses where they could revere their ancestors. And so in this shrine, they would have silk paintings or other paintings of their ancestors hung on the walls, and there they could go in there to help them guide themselves. You would learn from your ancestors. So they did use some type of ancestral worship. So what are the emblems of prestige and status? He's dressed in official court robes and has a silk black hat. That wasn't common. He's seated with his feet raised, not touching the earth. He wears a rank badge of gold on his chest that has the insignia that would have been embroidered in silk on his actual robe. And that silk was expensive. It came along the Silk Road, and the fact that it was painted on silk also shows that this was a highly prized object. Has gold embroidery. Okay, so there was a Royal Bureau of Painting in Korea during this time, And so many artworks had to show elements of restraint and simplicity. So thinking about what elements of this show restraint and simplicity, right? He's seated in a very sort of static pose. He's in a very general three-quarter view. That would have been something that was common, that portraits had to be portrayed at this angle and for full body rather than just their head. We see crisp angular lines, so there's contour lines with very minimal shading. You can see his fabric and his arms are just little contour lines here. We don't really see any shading to make him look 3D. There's a careful attention to detail. When you look close at his face, you can see wrinkles, his bone structure, and this was part of the Korean belief that we really do need to identify who this person is. So that was all mandated by the government. Right, so here you can see a little bit more about his likenesses and the style. Okay, and another image that comes from the Pacific would be the image from New Zealand of Amati Wakinene. And so these objects have similar function. Remember that imagery like this is all based on ancestral worship and showing prestige. So they both have tattooing and silk and emblems of power and prestige from their respective cultures. I could see how AP would maybe want to compare these two. The last piece we have from Korea is Summer Trees by Song Sunam. And this is actually part of the Global Contemporary section. You can see that this is from 1983. However, Sunam's style is rooted in his Korean ancestry. So this was made in the 1980s. However, this work really represents his history, the artist of the history of the history of the actual artist. It represents his youth and what was happening in Korea. Right? So what was happening in, let's say, the 1950s, 60s in Korea, right? So he was born to a very educated family, and he was trained in the traditional arts. So we'll see some examples of what those traditional arts are in just a moment. When we think about what was happening post-World War II in Korea, we know that the Japanese had occupied Korea during World War II. And then there was a spread of communism on the peninsula during the Cold Wars, which led to a civil war. And so I know my grandfather was in Korea in the 1950s as part of the American support of South Korea. So he would have been born into this turmoil. So this is the traditional style of the illiterati, or the poet painterly tradition of Korea. So let's look at the media. This is done typically on silk with ink, and this is the style that he's coming from. So when we look at his work, right, we can see how he too is using the traditions of silk painting. So he's thinking about how he can represent his background as a well-educated Korean, but also the traditions of Korea, being that they're silk, but also how can he be modern? Because he would have been painting this in a time that we consider to be modern art. So he's using, right, those brush techniques of how the ink is allowed to feather and bleed on the fabric. Notice how the edges aren't crisp. That would happen if you painted directly on silk. And it's very minimal. So just like the paintings that we have here, there's not a lot of detail. It's just enough to get across the idea. So silk painting, monochromatic, like one color, different values, and then simplicity. So when you look at this painting and you see just a series of vertical lines, you could be like me and just say, wow, that's just a really pretty value range that is done in a very minimal tradition, sort of like modernism that we saw at like the Vietnam War Memorial when we studied that. But he did equate these vertical lines to different concepts. And so he saw these works representing upright friends. Oh, something disappeared. They represent either upright friends, so friends that you could always depend on, or they represented trees. And so, because they are very solid and strong. This tradition of his work was being done in the 1980s, and a lot of artists were playing with fluid materials. So this is Morris Louis, an American artist, and he was allowing the paint to flow. And this is from the 60s. And so here we can see here, he's allowing the paint to, or the ink to drip and run and to bleed. And this was a tradition that was taking place in the 50s when he would have been a young child. His style is very similar to what we would consider to be minimalism. And so here we have a Sella and a Rothko, and you can see how they have elements of the ethereal quality of the brushwork and the layering of Rothko, and then the precision of some of these hard edge paintings. We're going to continue our look at Asian art, and we're going to be focusing on Japan today. We're going to be looking at converging cultures of belief. We'll see Buddhist art featuring Nara and Kyoto. So we're going to start in the area around Nara. And so we actually have one set from our textbook, and then we'll have the one from the 250. In this area, in around 607, this became a retreat for the Prince Regent. And in that, he chose Buddhism to be the state religion of Japan. And so there was a large construction campaign in this region to build these large monumental Buddhist temple structures. So this is at Todai-ji, and you can see some of the telltale elements that exist in temple complexes. So often they have bilateral symmetry. So like at Forbidden City, where we have a vertical line going through the middle, typically is equal on both sides. They often have pagodas. Pagodas are a house to place relics or sacred writings. They often have condos. This is the main worship hall. So this is where most people spend their time when they are looking at or meditating or circumambulating imagery of the Buddha. In the condo, there were several of these enamel paintings of the past lives of Buddha. And so this is one of those tales that we call the Jatka tales. And here it basically is where a hungry lioness sacrifices their body for a young tiger cub. And so there's the idea and this concept of sacrificing oneself for your own children. So the teaching of fundamental core beliefs, but also the idea that Buddha in a past life sacrificed himself for someone who was in need. Here is a triad from Todai-ji. So an image of Buddha. You can see stylistically very different than some of the other Buddhas that we've seen at other locations. So let's go ahead to Todai-ji in Nara. This is the set that is in the 250. We have several images from here. Most of the whole structures of the complex is made out of wood. It did burn down, so it has been reconstructed. So how does the scale and the imagery reflect the blend of Buddhism and the politics of the day, right? Why was the rebuilding it after fire so important to the shoguns? So, Sorry, I thought I had information there. The size and the scale. It would have had to been impressive. And so in order to show the power of the rulers, they made it enormous. And then to show the faith of the ruler, they also would want to put a lot of detail and wealth into the construction of it. And so even after the buildings were caught on fire, it was important for the shoguns to reestablish their power, but also to show their religious faith. So they rebuilt it. And actually, this condo is smaller than the original. I guess the original that was burned down was even bigger. I think this is like, if I remember right, like 40% of the actual size. So here's the entire complex. It's not as symmetrical as the other one that we just saw, but you can see that there is a sense of balance to it. In the very heart of it, the very center of it, we have the condo, which is that main worship hall. And then it has a series of 2 9-level pagodas on either side. There also is lecture halls and quarters for the monks to live. And I alluded to this the other day. It has beautiful gardens around it that have deers that are like there's probably more deers in this region than there are people. You know, to reflect the deer in the garden that Buddha meditated in and reached nirvana, right? So here's an example of the pagoda where a lot of religious objects were kept, relics, as well as sacred writings. And so to get into the complex, in the southern gate, there is a monumental gateway. And so we have that as part of our 250. So you can see that there are 3 large entrances into the sanctuary. You can see the slanting walls made out of wood, and it would be quite impressive as you are entering into this space. As you move through the gates, on the sides of you, there are large figures. So can you tell what the purpose of these figures are based on the visual evidence? What are the telltale signs? These are called the neos. They are a pair of protector images that stand guard at the entrance to this Buddhist temple. These versions have the open mouths as well as the closed mouth. So you can see one is open and one is closed, just like we saw at Long Men. The open mouth is to scare off the evil spirits. The closed one keeps the good ones in. Now, instead of being carved out of stone, these are large and they're carved out of wood. There's some great examples of Japanese guardian wood figures at the Art Institute of Chicago, but much smaller. The gate itself is actually called the Neomon, so it gets its name from these 2 guys. At many Shinto shrines, they aren't necessarily always guarded by these benevolent kings. Sometimes there's lion dogs or foxes as well. So let's look at how they convey their power and how they are different. So this would be good on your note taker to be able to figure out the differences between them, right? In both of these, they're very muscular. You see a lot of decoration. They both, you see a lot of definition of their muscles. So you can really see their muscle tone, their bulging, engaged muscles, right? You can see they have both pretty active poses, and they both have pretty intimidating faces, whereas the ones at Long Men, one of them is a little bit calmer. Right? Now, today, you can't actually see them as well as the images that we've just seen. They're covered in netting to protect them from fire and animals and from the other elements. So one is on each side of the gate. Okay, so then Let's get to our kondo. Remember that the kondo is located directly in the center of the complex. It's the largest building there. And so some context here is that this is probably one of the most important temples in this region. It's called the Great Eastern Temple. It is one of the largest wooden structures in the world. And it also contains Japan's largest bronze sculpture of Buddha, which is at 15 meters tall. So that one too is in our image set. It has a blending of Japanese wooden traditional techniques, as well as the Koreans' use of stone and brackets. So we can see that style moves from India to China to Korea and then eventually to Japan. And we can really see a blending of some of these stylistic characteristics and techniques. So you can watch this video. I can't because it will kick it out of YouTube. But you might want to look at how this imagery is influenced by Indian and Chinese Buddhist art and architecture. What are the similarities? This looks a lot different than the Buddha we just saw at Ryoan-ji. So here you can see some similarities between a Chinese Buddhist temple and the Japanese one. You can see they both have the large sloping roofs. You see that they are multiple tiered buildings. And then thinking about how this is similar. This really does focus on the traditions that come from India. We see we can allude to the bun at the top, the dot or the third eye in the middle. He has his mudra, he has his calm face. This one is very full. And then he has that full body halo, which is covered in these little bodhisattvas, his followers, all around the edges. He sits on the chakra. We'll see a detail of that in just a second. Right? And this is actually the chakra. This is where he's sitting on this lotus pedestal, and it's engraved with images of Buddha on the surface. This is actually probably the oldest part of the bronze sculpture, because the other one was destroyed and this one was rebuilt. I can't show you, but every year they clean this. So if you click on this link right at the bottom here, you'll see monks cleaning it. They basically go up in big buckets and hang from it. They're like rappelling from the ceiling in order to clean it because it's so massive. So let's focus on how Buddha is portrayed. Right? He's portrayed as cool, calm, and collected. And then his hands are really the things that are giving out the emotive quality of this. So explaining what he is saying. So his right hand is do not fear, right? So his right hand, this is do not fear. And his left hand is you're welcome. So he's welcoming people to the temple. Even though he's gigantic, you should not fear him. Right? So how do people integrate or interact with him, right? They would circumambulate, just like we've seen at multiple locations. This right here has a video on how this was poured in bronze. So this was used in a very similar way to how we use the lost wax process to build it. So I would highly recommend clicking on this to see how that process was made. Okay, the last imagery that we have for today is from Todai-ji, and this is near Kyoto, and we have a dry and a wet garden. So this was originally an estate of a branch of the Fujiwara family during the Heian period, and this served as a retirement home for the emperor, and eventually a military commander took the ruins of that and built a temple complex there. And so it started as a family estate, and then this military ruler converted it to a religious sanctuary. So this temple is located, like I said, in Kyoto, and it belongs to some beliefs in Buddhism that is based on Zen Buddhism and Shintoism. So we're going to focus on those two elements of Japanese religious faith. So what's the emphasis of Zen Buddhism? So this is your context, right? There is an emphasis on meditation and this idea that enlightenment and awakening by the means of self-introspection, meditation, and personal experience. So the construction of this complex is all based on aiding people in their meditation and their introspection. So Shintoism, this is an ancient Japanese tradition where there was a reverence for nature. You maybe have seen a bonsai tree that's like pristinely, losing the word here. They take a lot of time and attention to make it perfect. There's also a practice of, if a tree looks like it's dying and falling, instead of cutting it down, they'll prop it up. They'll hold it up to allow for it to continue to live and to grow. So there's this reverence for nature. So the entire complex really does show this emphasis on the reverence for nature. And so we have a map of it. And so from the map, can you tell how you would experience this complex? There's a lot of paths. So there's a lot of ways for you to walk and meditate and to really view the beautiful nature that you see in all of this green parts. You can see the mountains, you can see the ponds, you see these beautiful structures that are going to be nestled into the beauty of that natural environment. Okay. So part of it is this big, gigantic mirror pond. And that's going to be part of the wet garden that we see. Pilgrims would enter into this monastery, be able to see all this water, and then they would make their way to some of the different structures. So the detail images that we have for this one. The first one we're going to look at is the dry garden. So that's the image that we have on the top side here. A dry garden obviously doesn't have any water features or trees or anything like that. This one is a rectangular courtyard that has 15 rocks set on patches of moss, in the midst of a sea of white gravel. So all of this gravel is meticulously raked to make it nice and uniform. And you can't even see people's footprints in it. You might see some of the raking marks. And so that's kind of like the evidence of the person, or that someone had done that. And then thinking about this contextual image at the bottom, how does one relate to the dry garden? How are you supposed to experience it? Right? So you would observe the garden, right? And you would meditate, right? You would focus. The function of this spot is for meditation. So you'd sit on this wooden area and look out into the dry garden. And so you could see the changing of the environment, the changing of the seasons, the natural world going on. You could tell the time and the change of the day. And you would be able to know the subtle differences in the rock formations, in the moss, and you could even move around where you're not necessarily sitting in the same place in the garden. Right? So how does the garden reflect the traditional Shinto religion? Remember that Shintoism focuses on being diligent, right? Being diligent. And so these rocks are strategically placed. Even though there's 15 rocks, you are always missing one rock from your view. So it's very methodically laid out. And then of course, a monk goes out there every single day and rakes it so that it is perfect. So there's a lot of ritual and precision incorporated into this dry garden. Now, it's paired, a dry garden is typically paired with a wet garden, right? So why would that? You would want to be able to show opposites. It might not necessarily be yin and yang, but there would be this sense of balance, right? This focus on balance. And so around the garden, around the large reflecting pond are these gardens, and the buildings are really nestled into the natural environment. So here's some different views of how you see the seasons in this complex, Ryoan, right? So the style of these dry gardens do have an influence. And so if you notice this Chinese painting on the top right, what are the similarities in the characteristics? Right? So it looks like part of this is missing. Sorry about that. It is basically based on mountains and water, right? Even though this isn't water, it looks like water, right? It's very austere, it's very simple, right? So what's the possible meanings of the arrangements? There are several of them. I think some of them are a little bit more believable than others, right? So one, meditation. These rocks are organized so that you can focus. So you have not reached enlightenment, okay? You haven't reached enlightenment. You can only see 14 out of 15 rocks at one time. If you could see 15 out of 15, you can reach enlightenment, or you have. And so this is kind of this idea that you're always striving to be able to be all-seeing. Some also think that it represents islands floating in an ocean, which is probably pretty more obvious visually. Some people believe that it's a mother tiger carrying their cubs across the sea. So the larger one would obviously be the mother. Others think that it just symbolizes the Japanese aesthetic of wabi and sabi, this idea of refined austerity and subdued taste, that it's just very minimal. And then most recently, people believe that it's just an abstract composition meant to incite meditation. So you're not really supposed to understand it. It's just supposed to be simple and austere to aid in your meditation. So here you can see how it's raked around these islands of moss. And then this garden is connected to the Hojo, which was a personal study for the abbot as well as learning quarters. It also is connected to a tea house. And so inside of it, it has these big, large open areas and large windows where you could really appreciate the natural environment. It's very common on these screens that divide the rooms to have large paintings, and very similar to what we saw with the Chinese paintings, they're really focused on water and land and water and mountains. And this is the tea house that is part of the tea ceremony. And so if you really, really want to, I learned about the Japanese tea ceremony as a child when I watched the movie Karate Kid. And so if you really want to watch that, feel free to click on the tea ceremony from the Karate Kid.